To all who come to this happy place, welcome.
Hello and welcome to the brand new episode of the Beyond Disney podcast. I am so excited you're here. Whether you've been here before or you are listening in for the first time, I am so happy that you're here. On the last episode, we talked about Disney memories, Disney plushies, Walt Disney, and the iconic Disney nostalgia. If we're being honest, it's more of an addiction. If you enjoyed that last episode and want to keep the Disney magic going, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tap that bell icon so you never miss an adventure. Today, we're continuing the conversation with a deeper look into the man behind the mouse, the visionary dreamer, storyteller, and innovator, Walt Disney. So grab your Mickey ears, get cozy, and let's journey beyond Disney together. Now, Walter Elias Disney was born December 5th, 1901. His parents were Elias and Flora Disney, and Walt was born in Chicago as the fourth son of the Disney family. The Disney family had moved to Chicago for Elias to pursue a career in carpentry. The Disney family had been attending St. Paul Congregational Church, where Elias was a deacon and Flora would play the piano. Elias had become good friends with the pastor, and their wives soon became pregnant at the same time. Elias made a deal with the pastor that if their wives both have boys, they must name them after each other, and sure enough, they did. So Elias named his son Walter. The minister's name, as you can guess, was Walter Parr. The Disney family would then move in 1906 from Chicago to a farm in Marceline, Missouri. This is the town that Walt Disney would grow up in and find the inspiration for Main Street USA in Disneyland. At the age of 4, around the same time the Disney family had moved to their farmhouse, Walt would gain an aspiration for drawing. He would sketch his horse Rupert and was always encouraged by his neighbor, Doc Sherwood, to draw more, which he would sell his sketches to later on. Now, this would continue to happen for Walt, with family, friends, and neighbors, only at the age of 7. In 1911, when Walt was only 9, he began working with his brother Roy on a newspaper route, and they worked this route until Walt was 15. Walt Disney often shared stories of how he would sometimes wake up, passed out in the snow, not knowing how much time had even passed. The Disney family then moved to Kansas City to work the newspaper route that Elias Disney had purchased for the Kansas City Star. Roy and Raymond Disney, one of Walt's other brothers, worked the farm with their father, as Walt was tasked with watching his younger sister. In 1917, Roy left home to join the Navy. In 1919, Roy Disney was honorably discharged after Roy had contracted tuberculosis. Roy was a huge part of Walt's life. Out of all the siblings Walt had, he was the one who, even though he didn't always agree with Walt's endeavors, he supported him through them all. Now, when Walt was born, Roy was tasked with taking care of Walt, and was always there to watch over him, often taking him on walks, playing with him, making sure that he was entertained, and as you can tell, this became more than just his chore, and became a lifestyle for Roy later on. Now, Walt Disney was homeschooled by his mother until he was 7 and old enough to take his younger sister Ruth to school with him, to Park Elementary in Marceline. Walt was noted to have not been an attentive student and was always finding other things that captured his interest, especially cartooning. Both Walt and his sister Ruth would later attend Benton Grammar School in Kansas City, Missouri from 1911 to 1917, and that was the only school that Walt graduated from. During the ceremonies, Walt drew cartoons in his peers' yearbooks. Now, the principal was very fond of Walt's cartoons and art that he won a $7 award and was actually known for being the kid that would actually become a cartoonist. In 1917, the Disney family moved from Marceline to Chicago, which is where Walt began his freshman year at McKinley High School, which would become his only year of high school. At 13, Walt Disney would work to improve his skills in performing by attempting to impersonate Charlie Chaplin in theater contests. He would actually enter every single one that he could to gain experience. Walt Disney didn't seem to want to quit. Later in Walt's life, he would recall just how much he aspired to be like Charlie Chaplin, and kind of accomplish some of that with Mickey Mouse. Walt, at 16, watched his older brother Roy enlist in the Navy on June 22, 1917. Walt later recalled being impressed by how sharp Roy looked in his sailor uniform, which inspired him to follow in his brother's footsteps. Two of Walt's other brothers, Ray and Herbert, also joined the military in serving the newly established American Expeditionary Corps. Walt, along with his friend Russell Moss, initially tried to enlist, but their plan hit a snag when Moss was turned away due to poor eyesight. Unwilling to go without him, Walt gave up on the idea, for the time being at least, and the two instead took jobs at the post office. Eventually, Moss discovered that the Red Cross Ambulance Corps was accepting volunteers as young as 17. They applied under the name St. John's Brothers, but were denied. Determined, the pair plotted to sneak away and try again. However, their plan was uncovered when Russell's mother found his suitcase packed and alerted Walt's mother, bringing their scheme to a halt. Although Walt's parents were uneasy about his desire to serve overseas, he eventually convinced them by saying, "I don't want my grandchildren asking me, 'Why weren't you in the war? Were you a slacker?'" Moved by his words, they agreed to let him go. In one of his earliest acts of creative deception, Walt changed the year of his birth on his passport application from 1901 to 1900 to meet the age requirement. The original document is now preserved in the Walt Disney archives, and upon close inspection, the alteration is clearly visible. Walt and Russell were soon outfitted in uniforms and sent to Camp Scott, a temporary training site set up in a former amusement park near the University of Chicago. There, instructors from the Yellow Cab Company actually trained them in vehicle mechanics, teaching them how to fix engines, put cars together, and take them apart, and drive across difficult terrain as well. This was followed by 2 weeks of intense military-style drills. Could you imagine that? Like, imagine just having to go and take a car apart and put it back together, and then having to go and do like military drills and exercises, and then repeat that action for 2 weeks. That seems intense. But Walt was determined, and it seems like he didn't want to stop there. Especially now that Walt had become ill from an influenza that hit Chicago, and his parents would have to take care of him. Now, when Walt had recovered, he was sent to France, where Walt drove an ambulance which is said to have been decorated with cartoon characters that would actually later become characters in his future films. The Walt Disney Family Museum actually commented that these cartoons were used to provide humor to the soldiers and show Disney's patriotism and support for the troopers. It truly became a way for Walt to use his talents to entertain and bring joy during a challenging time. Now, there was a rumor about Walt Disney getting dishonorably discharged, which isn't true, but there is a conversation that happened with Walt Disney sharing this. "It was in February. They sent me with a white truck." He later recalled, "I was the driver and I had a helper, a white truck loaded with beans and sugar to the devastated area in Soissons. Well, I went out of Paris and it started to snow. I got up part way and I burned out a bearing on the truck, close to a watchman's shed. So, the orders were never to leave your truck. Sugar and beans were gold. So the helper was supposed to go, and I'd stay with the truck. There was this little watchman's shed, and I sat with the watchman, but I sat 2 nights and no help came. So, the 3rd day, I was so tired, so sleepy, that I left my truck and walked up to this town and ordered a meal. Then I got a bed, and I flopped into this French bed. And I slept clear around the clock. When Disney returned, the truck had disappeared. After hopping on a train back to Paris, he figured out what happened, saying this helper got into Paris and went out that night before he reported to the headquarters and got drunk, and he was drunk for 2 days. Then he finally reported, and he came to find me. I was gone, and he picked up the truck, so I was court-martialed. When stood before the board, a man he'd worked for came to Disney's defense exclaiming, 'Look, this boy sat there for 2 nights. He said, what happened to the helper? Have you court-martialed the helper?' They said yes. He was in the break. In the end, Disney was let off. So in a sense, it wasn't that he was dishonorably discharged, but he almost was court-martialed. And that's very interesting, to say the least. It's said that before Walt Disney wanted to leave to return home from Paris, he actually got a picture in his khaki uniform. Upon returning home, he needed to find work. And, well, this is the part of the story that truly takes the earlier years of Walt Disney and tests his character and willingness to never quit. It is now 1919, Walt is no longer serving in the military, and it is 4 years until Walt would join his brother Roy and start the Disney Company. Now, before we continue, I'd like to comment on a few areas of Walt's life that still kind of blows me away. You see, Disney has released many documentaries and different pieces of media, as well as allowing different media to produce and show different aspects of Walt's life. And primarily the reason for that is how Walt had connections with all of the major studios during his time building his Disney empire. Now, with these studios, they offered and allowed him to use and partner with their studios in order to make his media. And so because of that, I'm sure there's different aspects of his life that is told by each studio. For example, there have been many different documentaries released on Walt Disney's life, such as the movie Walt Before Mickey, which in this movie also shows the younger years of Walt Disney that's not really known by many. Now, is this movie historically accurate? It is more of a drama movie, so not necessarily as accurate to what the books say, but there are pieces in the movie that really do display what Walt might have actually gone through, what his experience was like, especially forming his first studio, and the trials that he made, losing friends and making friends. And then, of course, the history documentaries of Walt's life that you can find pretty much everywhere. I mean, Walt Disney had very interesting early years, as you might have already been able to tell from what we've learned so far in exploring his life. And even when it comes to talking about his fascination with Charlie Chaplin, as well as him being on stage performing, you kind of get a sense of what Walt was trying to get at, as he didn't like learning or sitting in school, as sometimes he'd even skip class, they say, or skip school that day to go and perform in these contests, or even he would find himself doodling on school-provided textbooks that, although the teachers did find his cartoons and drawing very brilliant and amusing, it didn't always turn out in Walt's favor the way that he thought it would. And so, because of his experience growing through school and growing just as a child, we can already see that he had more room in his head for his imagination than for his learning, which is why he preferred to do more practical things than sit in a classroom in a textbook, which is probably going into why he didn't graduate high school. Now, it is said that Walt later went back and finished his diploma and his degree because he overall realized the value and importance of knowledge. And with his Newman Laugh-O-Gram studio, the animation and cartoons that he worked on was primarily fairy tales. And that kind of gives a glimpse into the future of what Walt Disney would overall produce, which is still fascinating to me considering that he actually never made a production of Little Red Riding Hood or Puss in Boots, which were some of his first pieces to work on at his Newman Laugh-O-Gram studios. Now, with the success of Disneyland in the 50s, there were talks about smaller parks that would have been made throughout the U.S., and one of those parks would have been in a mall kind of similar to the Mall of America in Minnesota. But with this concept, they wouldn't have actually gone in the route of using Disney media that had already been produced, like a Disney movie, but actually American traditional stories that were still read today, and would have turned them into the same kind of dark story ride that were at Disneyland. Now, continuing back into the focus of this episode, which is continuing Walt's life. During Walt's time in France, he took the experience as an adventure in time to take inspiration for his drawings. From what he saw and what he learned, his peers were fond of his drawings and what he overall came up with during his time there. That they actually had requested him to do caricatures of them so that they could send them home to their families. Now, these opportunities that these sketches that Walt would do in cartoons would soon bring Walt to homesickness, as he was there for, I believe, only a year, but because of his adventures and because of his successes, he wanted to get home and he wanted to start putting it all to action. He missed Kansas City and he missed his family, and so he eventually requested to be discharged from the Red Cross, and in the fall of 1919, he traveled home. Walt had returned home and right off the bat started what would be a great many attempts to start his career. Now, Walt Disney had returned home and right off the bat started what would be a great many attempts to start his career. Walt gets a job at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio for $50 a month, which isn't a bad deal, especially in the time that he was living in, where he becomes an apprentice artist and actually crosses paths with Ub Iwerks. Now, Ub Iwerks becomes one of his close friends who would work with Disney and later on even move to California to further work with Disney and become one of the most iconic and skilled animators that Disney would hire to that day. Now, Walt Disney joins Iwerks and they co-found the Iwerks Disney Commercial Artists. The company overall failed after 1 month, and then they joined the Kansas City Slide Company in Kansas City, and actually that's where Walt first discovered animation. Now, it is said that Disney had recently applied for another job and they had turned him down, and because of that he continued to work with the Slide Company. Now, with the Slide Company, they discovered animation, and if they had not discovered animation, Walt Disney would later actually get a job offer from that same company that he had applied for. But because of the discovery of animation, Walt Disney didn't want to leave, and so he overall turned them down. While Walt had overall kept his day job at the KC Film Ad Company, Walt created the Newman Laughograms, which produced advertising, tropical shorts, and story cartoons. Now, come 1922, Walt Disney incorporated Laughogram Films, Inc., with $15,000 that he had attained from backers. With Laughograms, Walt was able to produce animated shorts with fairy tales such as Little Red Riding Hood and Puss in Boots. Walt Disney produced this series that he called Alice Comedies, which featured a little girl interacting with animated characters, solving mysteries, and going on adventures, which became a hit for Walt as it was the first media to cross over live action with animated shorts. Yet they didn't do well enough to hold over, as the comedies were only reaching limited audiences. So during this time, Walt had signed a contract with Winkler Comedies and was writing letters back and forth in order to stay up to date and keep communication accurate. With this, his work had begun to reach more audiences, even the president. They had success, but overall, the studio would face financial difficulties as the Winkler Comedies would stop being able to fund and offer Walt the money that he needed. So Walt and Laughogram Studios would overall go bankrupt. And because of the bankruptcy, Walt had overall began to lose all of his assets, leaving only a suitcase and $40 in cash for Walt to take with him. Now, during this time as well, Walt had difficulty being able to keep up with living investment as well as keeping the company together, as many of his animators had left him for better jobs that would pay well. Now, Roy had ended up moving to a tuberculosis rehabilitation center in Los Angeles and actually heard of Walt's misfortunes. that he encouraged his younger brother to move and leave it all behind. Walt would overall sell his things, bringing just a suitcase and $40 in cash. But what is overall hilarious is the fact that Walt Disney bought a first-class ticket on his train ride from Kansas City to Los Angeles, California. The life of Walt Disney is a life of hardship, strife, and perseverance. It is truly inspiring to know that from where Walt Disney was and where his life led to, he still had such a passion and longing to do what he loved most, which was using his imagination through dreaming. Now, there's still so much more to cover in Walt Disney's life, but we'll get to that in the next episode, which will be part 2 of The Man Behind the Mouse. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave a like, press that bell icon, subscribe, and then share this to a friend who you think would enjoy these kind of discussions. Thank you for being here. There's still so much more information to dive into while exploring the facts, the history, and the magic of Disney. Until next time, let's keep moving forward into the great and beautiful tomorrow.
With the hope that it will be a source of joy and inspiration to all the world. Thank you.